You hear the word postmodernism, and right away it sounds, well, heavy, academic, maybe a little intimidating. But what if we forgot all that? What if instead we treated it like a detective story, a mystery, with clues hiding in plain sight, in art, in philosophy, even in our everyday lives? So, let's start our investigation. And it begins with a very, very strange piece of evidence.
So picture this. It's 1976. You walk into the famous Tate Gallery in London and you see this. It's a piece by an artist named Carl Andre called Equivalent 8. And yeah, it is exactly what you think it is. Just a neat rectangle of 120 fire bricks. That's it. It wasn't trying to be beautiful, it wasn't complicated, and for a lot of people it was just kind of boring, and honestly, deeply annoying.
Which of course leads to the one question on everybody's mind, the question that was all over the news back then. Seriously, why is this pile of bricks art? It's a totally fair question, and it just so happens to be the central clue in our whole mystery.
All right, so to crack the case of Equivalent 8, we've got to look beyond the bricks themselves. We need to start asking some questions about the context, about where they are and what that means.
Okay, so the simplest answer is, well, it's art, because it's in an art gallery. The institution, the museum, the experts, the critics, they're the ones who get to slap the art label on it. But that feels like a bit of a cop-out, doesn't it? It's true, but it's not the whole story, because these bricks are doing something more.
See, they're not just commenting on art. They're a clue. They're pointing to this massive shift in thinking, a moment where all the old, comfortable certainties started to feel a little shaky. The bricks themselves aren't the masterpiece. The questions they make us ask, that's the masterpiece. And that gets us right to the heart of postmodernism.
There was this philosopher, Jean-François Lyotard, who totally nailed this shift with one killer phrase. He said the postmodern condition is an incredulity towards meta-narratives. So, what on earth is a meta-narrative? A meta-narrative is basically a big story. One of those giant, all-encompassing explanations that a whole culture tells itself to make sense of everything. Think about stories like the inevitable march of progress, or the idea that science will one day solve every problem we have. These are stories that claim to be the one true story for everyone, everywhere.
And this shows the clash perfectly. On one side, you've got the super confident stories from a time like the Enlightenment. And on the other, you have postmodernism's skeptical questions. So when the big story says, history is about progress, postmodernism leans in and asks, progress for whom? It starts poking holes in the idea that there's just one single objective truth that works for everybody.
So, look, if you take away just one thing, make it this. Postmodernism is that feeling of suspicion. It's that moment we all take a step back and ask, hey, are these grand stories we grew up with really the whole picture? But how do you even begin to challenge a story that big? Well, you're going to need a special set of tools.
And the number one tool in the postmodern toolkit, the thing they use to take these big stories apart, is called deconstruction. Now, it sounds complicated, I know, but the basic idea is actually pretty simple. Deconstruction comes from a philosopher named Jacques Derrida, and you can think of it as being a detective for language itself. It's a way of reading something, a book, an idea, anything, so closely that you start to see the hidden gears and wires underneath, all the unspoken assumptions and biases that are secretly holding the whole thing together.
Here's how it often works. Our whole language is built on opposites, right? Man versus woman, reason versus emotion, civilization versus nature. Deconstruction points out that in almost every one of these pairs, one side is treated as the default, the better one. But then, and this is the killer move, it shows that the superior term can't even exist without the so-called inferior one. You can't define civilized without defining what's savage. And just like that, you reveal that what looks like a natural pair of opposites is actually a hidden power structure baked right into our words.
And this isn't just some fun word game. The thinker Roland Barthes really captured how radical this is. He's saying that when you start messing with the idea that words have one fixed, stable meaning, you're not just playing around. You are fundamentally challenging the biggest sources of authority out there. Those big ideas with capital letters like reason, science, and the law, which all get their power from pretending they are universal and unchanging.
Okay, I get it. This all feels really philosophical, unpacking words, questioning concepts, but how does any of this connect to real life, to power, to to politics, to the way we actually live our lives.
Well, that's where another major thinker comes into the story, Michel Foucault. He's the one who showed that these language games, they aren't games at all. They are the actual machinery of social control.
Foucault's big idea is something called discourse. Just think of it as a whole system of language that defines a subject. So medical discourse defines who is healthy and who is sick. Legal discourse defines who is a criminal and who is law-abiding. And the key thing is, these aren't neutral descriptions of reality. They are systems that have immense power.
And here's the mind-bending part. These discourses don't just describe the world, they actively create it. By defining what's normal, they automatically create what's abnormal. They draw the circle and decide who's on the inside and who gets pushed to the margins as the other, the outsider, the deviant, the one who doesn't fit.
This completely changes how we think about our own self. Postmodernism says, forget the idea that there's one stable, true you at your core. Instead, it suggests we're more like a messy intersection of all these competing discourses, from science, from religion, from pop culture, all pulling us in different directions. Our identity isn't some solid thing. It's more like a performance we're constantly putting on.
The artist Cindy Sherman's work is the perfect example of this. In her famous series of photographs, she takes pictures of herself dressed up as all these different female stereotypes from old movies. She's the seductive femme fatale in one, the innocent girl next door in another. So, which one is the real Cindy Sherman? Her work suggests maybe there isn't one. Maybe there are just roles to play, performances to give.
So, where does all this leave us? Well, we find ourselves living in a world where the big stories don't feel so believable anymore, where language seems slippery, and where even our own sense of self feels kinda constructed. This whole vibe is what people sometimes call the postmodern condition.
And you can see the results all over our culture, which has developed its own ways of dealing with it. You've got pastiche. Think of a Quentin Tarantino movie that mashes up kung fu, westerns, and old detective films. You've got irony, where nobody seems to mean what they say. And you've got self-reference, where a movie is constantly reminding you that you're watching a movie. These are all signs of a culture that's very aware of and pretty skeptical about its own stories.
One critic pointed to this building, the Westin Bonaventure Hotel in LA, as the perfect metaphor for this feeling. It's this confusing, self-contained little city with no clear entrance or center. It's designed to make you feel a bit lost. It's an architecture that mirrors our own feeling of being lost in the massive, confusing map of global culture. Which brings us right back to where we started, back to our first clue, that pile of bricks. And now we can finally see what it was up to. It wasn't a prank, and it was never meant to be beautiful. Its entire job was to be a giant question mark, sitting right in the middle of a museum, forcing everyone to ask, what is art anyway? Who gets to decide? And what kind of story is this place trying to tell me?
And that leaves us with the ultimate postmodern question, the one that's still hanging in the air. The old certainties, those grand narratives, they might be in pieces. We've taken them apart and seen how they were built. So the mystery is no longer what postmodernism is. The mystery now is, what do we do next? If we can't trust the big stories from the past, how in the world do we figure out which new, maybe smaller, more honest stories are worth building a future on, together?